So today we're going to talk about emotional behavioral disorders. I know that I did not get the chance to go through all of the material on specific learning disabilities last week. I did mention that we would be resuming that discussion today, but I've made the decision to hold off on that. The slides are on Canvas, so do have a look at those that we did not get to in our discussion. You all should have received a message from me that I put up a rubric for the paper. Feel free to email me if you have any questions regarding it. I did that just because it can be helpful, for you all in terms of knowing, exactly kind of what I'm going to be looking for in the assignment. So let me go ahead and get my slides going here.
So I just looked at the slides and downloaded them.
Yes.
I think it was this class only had 2 and the other one had 4.
So you're saying on Canvas there were only 2?
Yeah, on the files.
Oh, I have not put them up yet. Okay. Well,
So it would be this, probably the one from last week, maybe.
So yeah, no, I just need to upload the files, the slides from last week. Yes,
Yeah.
those are the ones that are missing. Class number 3. Okay, so we'll talk about emotional or behavioral disorders tonight. And as always, we'll start off with definitions. And certainly emotional or behavioral disorders is one of those disability categories served by IDEA that is contentious in the sense that people really disagree on how the condition has been formally defined. And as we discussed in our first meeting, there's a big argument, especially with respect to emotional behavioral disorders, that there's kind of a big social component to the construction of what is considered an emotional or behavioral disorder, and we'll get into that a bit more as we progress. So IDEA defines it as a condition exhibiting one or more of a number of characteristics. These characteristics should be present over a long period of time and to a marked degree. And as with all disabilities that a student will receive special education for, it must adversely affect a child's educational performance. And just very quickly, these include an inability to learn that cannot be explained by intellectual, sensory, other health factors. There's a social component here, so the inability to build or maintain satisfactory interpersonal relationships with peers and teachers. Inappropriate types of behavior or feelings under normal circumstances. So exaggerated aggressive acts, for example, in the context of a situation that would not, call for such a heightened response. General pervasive moods of unhappiness or depression, and tendencies to develop physical symptoms or fears that are associated with personal or school problems. And schizophrenia is included under this category of emotional disturbances, so that's important to note. And so, as I mentioned, there are people who have issues with the definition of EBDs that IDEA or uses. Excuse me. While it seems specific, the argument made in the book is that, well, it's actually quite vague. The definition uses terms such as satisfactory and inappropriate in terms of behavior used in certain settings or environments. And certainly, what one person considers satisfactory behavior might be considered unsatisfactory behavior by another. What one individual considers inappropriate might be less so to another individual. So there is kind of a subjective component to this definition that IDEA provides for us. And the textbook discusses a number of factors that contribute to this vagueness. And I've already spoken to a few of these. You know, teachers are willing to tolerate, you know, student misbehavior more specifically, to varying degrees. Teachers and parents might have different expectations for a student's behavior. Different cultural groups might have different expectations for a student's behavior in the classroom. And what does this result in? Basically that the referral and identification of students with EBDs can be a very highly subjective process. I think this is, you know, certainly the case for students who are not very severely affected by EBDs. We have another definition of EBDs that was drafted in response to these problems that we discussed regarding IDEA's definition of emotional behavioral disorders. This definition is provided by the Council for Children with Behavioral Disorders. And, you know, kind of one of the questions that is raised by IDEA's definition is that what is this difference between emotional disturbance and social maladjustment? The textbook talks about this idea that, you know, social maladjustment does not necessarily indicate the presence of an emotional behavioral disorder. So the CCBD definition attempted to provide a more specific set of guidelines by which to define the parameters of a emotional behavioral disorder, or an EBD. I'll just start using that term from here on out. So it's a disability that is characterized by emotional or behavioral responses in school programs. So it specifically talks about school that are so different from age appropriate, cultural appropriate, or ethnic norms that the emotional or behavioral responses in the way of educational performance affect a student's social skills, their ability to be successful in the workplace, and you know, have a negative impact on other types of personal skills. They're more than a temporary expected response to stressful events in the environment. And so this is really getting at this idea that students with this disability often may respond in ways that are greatly exaggerated, that seem, you know, quote unquote, too much for the conditions that provoke them. The behaviors must consistently be exhibited in 2 or more settings, at least one of which is school related. And lastly, these emotional or behavioral responses are unresponsive to the kinds of direct instruction that students might be receiving in the general education classroom. So this term includes, it allows for the, you know, a student to have an emotional behavioral disorder comorbid with another disability, so at the same time as another disability. It includes schizophrenia, affective disorder, or excuse me, affective disorder, anxiety disorder, and other sustained disorders of conduct or adjustment that are affecting the child adversely in terms of their educational performance. The textbook talks about, or the textbook provides us with what the advantages are according to the CCBD with respect to this definition of EBD as opposed to IDEA's definition of EBD. One of them is that it clarifies the educational dimension of the disability. The IDEA definition didn't really, it talks about an inability to build or maintain relationships with peers and teachers, but it doesn't really kind of specifically, explicitly identify the fact that there's a huge educational component to this condition. Again, it focuses on the child's behavior in school settings, and it attempts to place behavior in the context of appropriate age, ethnic, and cultural norms. Lastly, it increases the possibility of early identification and early intervention. And so, as we'll see, there's, currently the movement is to shift from reactive methods for identification to proactive methods for early identification. In similar ways that RTI is used, as a proactive as opposed to a reactive approach for identifying students who might qualify for special education. Any comments or thoughts about definitions of emotional or and behavioral disorders?
I just have a comment on it.
Oh, yes, Becca.
So I teach in the behavior room in my school. I feel like the term emotional disturbance is like not, I don't know. I just don't enjoy saying it all the time. Has it ever, do you know if like
it's very stigmatizing.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you, has there ever been any kind of like, I know I see it here as like a behavioral disorder or emotional disorder. I don't know. Has there ever been any like changes in that? Like, do you think that's going to stick forever, or what can change that?
Well, I think, advocacy groups, people with emotional or behavioral disorders, advocating for a change in the language used by the federal law to qualify the condition. That's what changed the language from, for example, mental retardation to intellectual disability.
Right.
It was advocacy, and not just parental advocacy, but also self-advocates, individuals themselves with the condition.
But what would be another name for that? Because it is, they have emotional instability.
Right, but I think emotional or behavioral disorder is a less kind of negative term than emotional disturbance.
That's true. Yeah. So they just took disturbance out of there.
Yeah. Like,
okay.
I've had IEP meetings, and I'm reviewing what the eligibility is, and it's like, it says emotional disturbance, and I had a parent yell at me.
Hard to read it out loud.
Huh?
It could be hard to read it out loud.
It was hard to read out loud, and it always is, but then when I read it, the parent freaked out on me, and I was like, that's just what it's called for our paperwork. Like that's what I said. I prefer to call it an emotional disability or disorder, but in our system it's called an emotional disturbance, and
right.
He wasn't very happy about it. And I was like, I get it. I totally get it.
Yeah. And it's not just your system, it's the federal government
Right.
of the United States' system. So yeah, it is an interesting observation, and it's kind of, when you look at the ways in which the other 12 categories of disability are labeled in IDEA, none of them have this like negative connotation of a disturbance. So very briefly, some of the characteristics of EBDs. So we talk about the kinds of behaviors that people with EBDs exhibit as externalizing or internalizing. That's one way of kind of categorizing them and differentiating between students who manifest with, different or degrees of the disability that are qualitatively different. And so externalizing behaviors are just commonly referred to as antisocial behaviors. And in the classroom, they include things such as, students just getting out of their seats, disturbing their peers frequently, excessive arguing, lying, stealing, having tantrums, being very aggressive, ignoring teachers' demands, etc., being non-compliant. These are all examples of as externalized behaviors. Was there a question? And again, these are referred to as externalizing behaviors because they're things that we can very clearly see, going on in the classroom. They might occur with little or no provocation and with very high frequency. Students, who are exhibiting the externalizing behaviors seem to be kind of constantly at odds with their peers in the classroom. And more importantly, all people in, different stages of development might, exhibit, varying degrees of externalizing behavior. But, as neurotypical individuals, we grow out of them as we develop and learn, about consequences to actions and social expectations. But individuals with emotional and behavioral disorders tend not to grow out of such behavioral patterns. We can contrast externalizing behaviors with internalizing behaviors. So these are also negative behaviors, but they're focused inward. So they're going to, look different than are the externalizing or the antisocial behaviors. A student that is showing internalizing behaviors or exhibiting internalizing behaviors might, engage in little social interaction with her or his peers. They might lack, show an obvious lack of social skills, specifically those required to develop and maintain relationships, both with their peers and with teachers. Just a general, overall degree of fearfulness, anxiety, phobias are also examples of internalizing behaviors. Depression, and importantly, this type of internalizing behavior, in addition to externalizing behavior, is going to greatly limit a child's ability to take part in the normal, range of activities that students without disabilities learn from and derive pleasure from. Other individuals have, attempted to kind of talk about the behavioral categories exhibited by individuals with EBDs in different ways. These researchers, Clay and Peterson, they talk about dimensions of problem behaviors, so conduct disorders. And so these, example of a conduct disorder or behavior that would be qualified in this dimension is physical aggression, difficulty. Socialized aggression, similar to the conduct disorder dimension, except that these behaviors are displayed in the company of others. They might include stealing, substance abuse, when they're with other people, truancy from school, gang membership, lying. Basically, engaging in kind of deviant behavioral patterns as a form of kind of fitting in. Attention problems, anxiety withdrawal, psychotic behaviors, motor tension excess. These are just, so I just wanted to put this slide in here just to let you know that in addition to the internalizing versus externalizing categories, that other people have kind of further broken down these types of behaviors that might be exhibited within those two broader categories or those broader types of characteristic behaviors. With respect to academic achievement, in general, students with EBDs will tend to, pass their grade level competency exams. So, tests required to progress from, one grade to the next more frequently than will students without disabilities and other disability groups. More likely to get that grades than students with other disabilities. Additionally, achievement deficits. I've already alluded to this a little bit when I indicated that deviant behavior patterns exhibited by people with EBDs tend not to be grown out of, and we see the same phenomenon occurring in the context of academic achievement, and that these deficits tend to worsen with age. Higher absenteeism rates than other groups of students, less likelihood of graduation, and very high dropout rates. So just some very general academic achievement characteristics exhibited by students with EBDs.
I'm actually curious about this higher absenteeism rate than other groups of students. I would say that in my experience working with students with a behavior disorder,
yes,
I actually have a lower frequency of absenteeism. They're like always at school, and in my situation, where I am, like most of them are always at school because home is less
desirable place to be.
So they're still at school, and I don't know, Nate, you teach in behavior. Do you experience the same kind of thing, or are they more frequently absent?
Much to my dismay, sometimes everybody's always there. Sometimes I just wish that like one kid would just like take a day,
right?
compose himself.
I'm gonna take a me day today, Nate.
Yeah. Today was a great day. Not really. I have two kids that refused to get on the bus, so I was at school. That's why I was a little late. But yeah, I find that the last year I saw that there were a couple students that were chronically absent, and this year they're still in my class this year, and their attendance has improved markedly. Like I see a lot of. I don't see that much absenteeism.
Right. We also, these outcomes are based off of data collected by the U.S. Department of Education.
Yeah.
So we're talking about national level trends, and certainly in our own personal experiences, we might observe the opposite, of what the larger picture is, right? Because when we look at a large enough sample, in the context of we're going to see trends, but there are always going to be people who deviate from those trends. So you bring up a good point, Becca, when you say that.
But most of the things I've seen in this slideshow, like every slide that comes along, I'm like, oh yeah, I know that guy. I know that.
Yeah. You just described my classroom.
Yeah, I think emotional and behavioral disorders are, they're a very challenging group of individuals to keep engaged in the classroom and to develop relationships with. Because as we'll see, as we progress deeper into my slide bank, the effective techniques for kind of educating and dealing with these behaviors and helping students to learn replacement behaviors that are more appropriate require an understanding of some kind of high level behavioral principles and techniques that kind of often go against what our instinctual or natural inclination might be in terms of responding to behavior. And really one of the really sad situations here is that this relationship between behavior problems and low academic achievement can, get into basically it's reciprocal. It creates kind of a negative feedback loop in that, behavior that is disruptive or defiant is going to interrupt classroom instruction, which is going to end up reducing such a student's level of participation in learning opportunities. And of course, this lack of engagement with the curriculum, with learning opportunities in the classroom, is going to ultimately lead to failures to learn or reductions in the amount learned compared to other individuals. And some instructors who are unfamiliar with appropriate means by which to address the challenges that students with EBDs might present in the classroom will, unwittingly exacerbate the situation, by using ineffective instructional techniques or in the ways that they respond to a student's off-target or disruptive behavior in the classroom. And certainly, this can lead to student frustration. And this leads to more disruptive or defiant behavior, which in turn leads to further limitations in classroom participation and further, gaps in achievement with respect to, or when we're comparing students with EBDs to students without disabilities.
I know this comes in later in our chapter, but it just does seem like that we're getting more and more behavioral, like severe behaviors in schools over the years, and things that we haven't really ever had to deal with before, like PTSD and some of the stuff like in the diagram you showed. I know when we talked about autism and some of that stuff, there was a trend. Are they seeing a large trend in this rising dramatically over the last 15 or so years?
Well, not in the literature that I've read, and the textbook doesn't speak to that. Actually, the textbook indicates that EBDs are one of the most underdiagnosed conditions.
Right.
So, when we talked about autism a few weeks back, I suggested that, changes to kind of the definition or the diagnostic criteria might have led to an overdiagnosis of the condition. But no, I am not aware of dramatic increases in the prevalence of emotional or behavioral disorders. As we'll see later in the slideshow when we talk about prevalence, it's like the seventh largest disability category served by IDA out of the 13. But you're right, you bring up an interesting point that, there definitely has been an increase in kind of these very challenging behavioral or conduct disorders in the past 15 to 20 years. And, it leads one to question, what is at the root of them? What is it in our society that is, kind of causing these effects? Because we'll talk about, potential causes of EBDs, and while researchers do find biological markers or genomic markers associated with EBDs or schizophrenia, often the greatest risk factors are social, right? The student's family life, and so these are factors that are often kind of outside of the reach of instructors such as ourselves. They require kind of wraparound services, other service providers who would be dealing with a student's home life environment.
So I kind of tie technology into it with how it's if it's not used appropriately at home. So if kids aren't getting that social recognition from their parents,
Yeah,
it's
no,
also
right.
dysfunctional. There's, I think, a lot ties into it, because if you think about the last 15, 20 years, when did technologies, become so prevalent in our lives?
Yeah, no, it corresponds kind of, exactly with this kind of dramatic increase in the availability of technology.
I've also wondered if it had anything to do with like the Great Recession and the lack of not food, but like, there were a lot of families, especially in lower income areas, that lost their paychecks. They lost, and there's a lot of research about what kinds of foods women eat while they're pregnant, what kinds of foods infants eat, and behavior problems later in life. And I've always been curious if we're going to see kind of, we've seen this, if you've been in education for the last 15 years, you've seen this increase, right? And I'm wondering if, and things are a little bit better now, are we going to start to see a decrease? And I haven't seen any studies about it, but it's something that I'm, when people ask me, well, why do we see, why do we always see this on the news? There's a news story every other day about class, clearing the classroom and this and that. I'm like, I don't know. This is definitely something that affected the families that I work with.
Yeah, that's a theory I heard 2 years ago. Kind of tying that together with especially the elementary age kids. And a lot of it too, maybe not food necessarily, but the stress the parents were under because of the recession.
Completely.
There's a lot of things that, I don't know, are kind of tying to it.
Again, as we'll see later, most of the risk factors associated with a diagnosis of EBDs are characteristics of the home environment. The ways that students interact or children interact with their parents, or the way that parents interact with their children, for example. And, there's always, it's likely not purely social. It's not just a result of kind of these home environmental factors. It's more likely a multi kind of factorial situation in which you might have genetic predisposition kind of coupled with these call them triggers, if you will, in a student's home environment. Just very quickly discussing intelligence. So students with EBDs are more likely to score below average on standardized IQ tests than children without disabilities. But the book brings up a good point here, and that is that while we might observe these differences in intelligence as measured by standardized IQ tests, this does not necessarily reflect the fact that students with EBDs possess less intelligence than children without disabilities, right? We already talked about the fact that the behavioral manifestations, the deviant or disruptive behaviors that a student or a child with EBD exemplifies in the classroom can get in the way of learning opportunities. So that doesn't necessarily mean that that student is less intelligent. It just means that that student has had less opportunities to learn. And I make that point here. And so when a student is not provided with, an adequate number of opportunities to learn, the types of tasks that these kind of tests are going to require of students, well, they will appear as less intelligent. But again, it's all about the number of learning opportunities. And then I already discussed the fact that another characteristic are challenges in developing and maintaining interpersonal relationships, both with peers and with teachers. This is also characteristic of autism that we'll talk about next week. But an interesting difference is that often students with autism are much more comfortable and much more effective at establishing relationships with adults than they are with their peers. Whereas with EBDs, the challenge is in the establishment of a relationship between both categories of individuals. And so they might often be rejected by their peers for obvious reasons. Externalizing behaviors, persistent instances of that type of behavior will lead to, other students wanting to keep a distance from these kinds of children. I mean, we could probably think back to our experiences as students and remember kids who, kind of expressed these types of behaviors, and they make a kid stand out. And again, these either internalizing or externalizing behaviors, are going to, in the same way that they get in the way of learning opportunity and academic contact, they're going to get in the way of learning opportunities in the social domain as well. And so, in addition to difficulty in keeping friends, other studies have shown that individuals with EBDs might experience lower levels of empathy toward other people. They're less inclined or concerned with, relating to how another person is feeling emotionally in a given situation. They're less inclined to be concerned with kind of how their behavior might, make another person feel. They participate in fewer extracurricular activities. Studies have shown that people with EBDs report lower quality relationships with their peers than control groups who do not have EBDs. And so it's very interesting kind of juxtaposition, these challenges in the social domain and the academic domain, kind of being traceable back to this fact that, the externalizing and internalizing behaviors characteristic of individuals with this disability are going to essentially just get in the way of learning experiences. And, there are critical windows for developing, skills, especially in the social domain. And by missing out on those opportunities, there can be very serious downstream effects. Students with tend to be arrested during their school careers more frequently than individuals without such disabilities. During middle school years, studies have shown that students with EBDs experience even higher rates of arrest than other individuals, and importantly are very likely to be recidivists or repeat offenders. So, sending students with EBDs to, juvenile detention centers is not a very effective approach to reducing the amount of recidivism that students with EBDs often exhibit. Just a few of the general characteristics of students with EBDs. There are more, and certainly the book goes into more detail, but I wanted to give us enough time to discuss the research-based or the evidence-based practices, because they're important practices to be aware of, because as we've already discussed, we're dealing with a behavioral disorder, and many individuals with disabilities exhibit, or the manifestations of their disabilities are behavioral in nature. So these types of interventions can be effective not only for students with EBDs, but students with autism, students with intellectual disabilities, students with ADHD. But just in terms of prevalence, if we look at our graph here, again, this is talking about my little blurb here says that approximately 361,100 students between the ages of 6 and 21 receive SPED services for an EBD in the 2012-2013 school year. This graph is actually from the 2017-2018 school year. I wasn't able to find the raw statistics for the number of students for those years for this school year, but we do see that EBDs are down here at just about 5% of all the students served by IDEA. And I've also mentioned that this is the most, or it's believed to be the most under-identified disability category. You know, mostly for kind of the subjective reasons that I discussed earlier in our discussion. More often than not, males are identified for special education based on a diagnosis of EBD, and males with EBDs tend to display more externalizing behaviors, so more of like the aggressive or antisocial behaviors, than do females, who tend to show more internalizing behaviors, such as anxiety and social withdrawal. But this is not to suggest that, you know, females will never have problems with aggression or antisocial behavior if they have EBDs, or vice versa, that males won't also experience internalizing behaviors. But statistics certainly show these trends. And one wonders if there is a social component to kind of these differences as well. Doggets. So again, it's always important that we consider potential causes of disability, and you know, the first place that researchers like to look is the brain for causes of disability, and with respect to EBDs, some people with the disability have undergone abnormal brain development, which might have been genetic, or you know, kind of out of their control. They were born with a condition referred to as dysgenesis, or even a brain injury caused by trauma that alters the structure or the function of a certain part of the brain that up until that point had been developing normally. And generally, you know, it's the frontal lobe, so the front part of our brain that's involved in kind of like emotional regulation and executive functions, that they see kind of differences between students with EBDs and students without EBDs in terms of kind of the functional connection of. But while some students, their EBDs can be shown to be the result of abnormal brain development or trauma, the majority of students show no evidence of brain damage or a brain disorder. And we already mentioned that schizophrenia is categorized under emotional behavioral disorder, according to both definitions that we looked at. And there are certainly genetic components to schizophrenia. It does run in families, and the textbook does talk about one very large scale study that showed 108 distinct locations in which the genetic makeup of individuals with schizophrenia differed than that of individuals without schizophrenia. But again, there's, just as in the case of autism, when we discussed that condition a few weeks back briefly, there's no smoking gun here. There's no, kind of single area of the genome that if it's affected, that an individual will be born with an emotional behavioral disorder. Other causes, temperament, so a person's behavioral style or their typical way of responding in situations. It's not something that's going to be the the cause of an emotional behavioral disorder, but it may predispose some children to problem in interacting with environmental factors. For example, it might make parenting interactions more difficult if a child has a very difficult temperament. And then we get into this negative feedback cycle again, where a child's difficult temperament, makes the parents' attempts at interacting with that child more difficult, and which might frustrate the child, which in turn makes the parental or the parents' attempts to interact with the child progressively more difficult. So certainly one of the kind of pieces of the causal picture could be a child's temperament. Environmental factors, we've already discussed the fact that a child's home environment has a huge impact on the probability that a child will be diagnosed with EBDs. And so children with this diagnosis are more likely to come from homes in which parents are inconsistent disciplinarians. So there's never an explicit set of rules that are enforced by both parents. As we'll see in the classroom, it's actually one research-based intervention, are clearly defined, explicit sets of behavioral expectations and rules that will help a student with an EBD be successful academically and socially. Parents who use harsh or excessive punishment spend little time engaged in pro-social activities with their children. So, Crystal, you mentioned technology. Certainly, if parents are kind of very often putting their children in front of screens or devices to keep them engaged, this would be an example of a non-pro-social activity with a child.
Or the parents on their devices when kids are seeking, recognition and they're not getting it.
Right. So that factor as well. That's a good point. Parents who don't monitor the whereabouts of their children, so that they're just kind of, unconcerned with or uninvolved with their child's lives, and very little show of affection or positive reinforcement for good behavior. So these are some of the environmental factors thought to be components to the development of EBDs in children. The school environment as well. Since most children with EBDs, they're not identified with them until they are in school. It has been questioned whether or not, just the school setting in our particular educational system itself might contribute to the development and manifestation of an EBD. There have been, studies that have looked into whether or not potential practices, educational practices, might contribute to the development of EBDs, and certainly ineffective instruction. So a teacher's inability to deal with a child's, antisocial or any other type of disruptive or deviant behavior. An instructor's inability to, engage a student with an EBD, which leads to academic failure. Again, like in the context of home, unclear rules and expectations for appropriate behavior. Inconsistent and punitive discipline practices. So that was also a characteristic of the home environment. Infrequent teacher praise and approval for academic and social behavior. And lastly, failure to individualize instruction, to accommodate diverse learners, or to implement culturally responsive practices. So some of the factors within a school environment that are thought might contribute to the development of emotional behavioral disorders. And lastly, community factors. These include associating with peers who exhibit antisocial behavior, such as being involved in gangs, substance abuse, deviant sexual behavior. But again, most chronic behavior problems that are persistent and that do not go away with age, are the accumulated effects of exposures to a variety of risk factors. So we're never able to just put our finger on one single causal factor. It's going to be, a combination of the family life, the experience in the neighborhood and the community, and experiences in the school system and other potential societal risk factors. The greater the number of these risk factors and the longer a child's exposure to them, well, the greater the probability that a child will experience negative outcomes, whether it be in the form of an EBD, emotion, like a formally diagnosed EBD, or just behavior that is maladaptive. So, identification and assessment. The textbook mentioned this statement that I thought was interesting. Many school districts do not use any systematic method for identifying children with EBDs. There isn't kind of one diagnostic approach that is effective in identifying all cases of EBDs. In general, identification in younger children can be more challenging just because, as children age and develop, typically their behavior changes very quickly and often. And another factor associated with identification and assessment is that especially students who display internalizing behaviors, they might tend to fly under the radar, so they might not call attention to themselves because they're not acting out in ways that a student who is demonstrating externalizing behaviors would be in the classroom. And so another just kind of issue with respect to the identification and assessment of emotional behavioral disorders. And so another unfortunate fact, many students who do have emotional behavioral disorders experience a great period of delay between the onset of the disability and the beginning of SPED services. And this could be it's likely to do with kind of some of these subjective factors we discussed at the beginning of class. So, parents might have different expectations for their child's behavior, and so, might not be concerned with the types of acting out that their child is demonstrating in the classroom, or teachers just might be more tolerant, and so not refer a student as early as would be appropriate for that student.
Could it be that some students aren't going to preschool, like they're staying home, so meaning that they haven't been in a structured environment?
Yeah, I would.
They don't have exposure to it.
If their home environment is very unstructured, so it's like that combination of missing out, like on a preschool kind of structured setting in concert with a very unstructured home environment.
Yeah, so they're getting identified way later than what they could be getting identified.
Yeah, I think that would definitely be a potential explanation for
some
situation for some students. Mm-hmm. But as always, we can't make a blanket statement and suggest that is the case for all students with these. And so I mentioned that kind of this fact that there exists this delay is really kind of shifting thinking in terms of the identification and assessment of EBDs from a reactive approach, which is generally used now. Like, we identify an EBD because of how the child is acting in the classroom. We're reacting to that situation, to a more proactive approach, using a more kind of structured and systematic kind of RTI type intervention. And we'll look at one example of this type of approach later in class. But now it's 6 o'clock. So why don't we take 10 minutes and we'll meet back here at 6:10.
Sounds good.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So the first step in the identification and assessment of EBD, like with most disorders or disabilities, is some sort of screening procedure. And a screening procedure is nothing more than the differentiation between children who show signs of behaviors characteristic of EBDs, whether externalizing or internalizing, between those students and groups of students who are not likely to have any disability. Students who, through a screening process, are flagged as, potentially or potentially individuals who, have an EBD that will adversely affect their educational experience, are then more than likely to undergo a not more than likely, they will undergo a much more thorough assessment process. We'll talk about the assessment process briefly, but screening tools are generally like rating scales in which parents or teachers or peers or some other individual that knows the student very well, rates a student's, kind of behavior on the dimensions, associated with EBD, an EBD diagnosis. And often, a child, her himself, might be asked to complete a screening tool. And from there, there would be behavioral observations, and we're going to talk about some of the ways in which behavior is measured and observed in the context of identifying an EBD in the next couple slides. And so probably the most effective way of doing this is through direct observation and measurement of behavior. And there are a few different dimensions or ways in which behavior can be measured. Frequency. Can somebody tell me what is a measure of behavioral frequency? What would we be measuring?
How often the behaviors are occurring?
Yep. How often a behavior is occurring? Duration.
How long it happens for?
Say it again.
How long it happens for?
Yeah. How long? How long does a child tantrum, for example, when we set the spelling test down on her or his desk? Latency. What is latency? It refers to an amount of time, right? How long? How many minutes elapse between when, Jimmy is told that he will not be allowed to go to recess today, and how many minutes elapse between when we tell him that and he begins to engage in disruptive behavior?
30 seconds.
Yeah.
12 seconds.
We all know a little Jimmy. Topography. What did that refer to?
Where it happens?
Form of the behavior. What is it? Yes. So it's referring to the form of the behavior. Cruelty to animals. That's a kind of a topographic characteristic of behavior. And lastly, the magnitude of the behavior. What is this referring to?
how bad it was.
Right.
So,
How severe, how
I don't like to say bad, but yeah.
How explosive it was.
the force or the intensity of the behavior. Exactly. And there are some advantages to direct observation and measurement of behavior. It allows us to identify and design intervention strategies and evaluations of treatment effects that revolve around both direct and objective measurement. You know, if we identify these behaviors that are problematic, well, we can, you know, come up with ways to try to reduce their frequency and in a particular environment. And we can know if our intervention strategies are effective because, you know, as we collect data on the behavior that we observe, we should see a reduction in the amount. So that's certainly one advantage. Another advantage is, it's leading directly to a focus on what is getting in the way of a child's learning opportunities and that child's way of dealing with it, and that's the behavior. And so there are a number of different types of or approaches, we can say, in the domain of direct observation of behavior and measurement, or measurement of behavior, excuse me. We're all familiar with functional behavior assessment, an FBA. And this is just merely a process of gathering information to understand why a student, might be engaging in a challenging behavior. The end result of an FBA is to come up with an idea or a theory or a hypothesis about what a behavior's function is, or what is its purpose. This can be challenging, right? A behavior, the function or purpose of a behavior isn't always what, we might kind of instinctively assume it is. There could be, a secondary function or purpose for the behavior that, as individuals who are not trained in the conduct of functional behavior assessments might miss. But generally, there are two functions to all behavior. Whether it's problem behavior or even non-problematic behavior. And these are positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. So what's an example of positive reinforcement? What does positive reinforcement do for behavior?
Increases the likelihood of recurrence.
You got it. Thank you, Bob. Positive reinforcement is going to increase the likelihood of the recurrence of a behavior. So if I, rip up, my worksheet every time a teacher puts it in front of me, and eventually the teacher just stops putting worksheets in front of me, and I don't have to do the worksheets, well, I've just been positively reinforced to continue ripping up that worksheet based on the consequence of my behavior. Consequence being the teacher, not putting the worksheet down in front of me. What about negative reinforcement? What is an example of what is negative reinforcement? This is often a misunderstood concept.
It's like taking something away, something out of the equation. It doesn't have to be a punishment. It's just like, I was just learning about this. I'm taking a course in ABA, and it's kind of what I do for work anyway. But generally people think it's like a negative thing, but it's supposed to just be meaning you're taking like the incentive or whatever out of the equation to get the desired behavior you want, right?
Right. It's referring to avoiding or escaping something the student doesn't want. So think about this. If you, in the morning when your alarm goes off on your cell phone or your alarm clock, if you still use one of those, you turn off that alarm, your sleeping behavior has been negatively reinforced. You have removed from the equation the interference that was getting in the way of your desired behavior, which was sleep. And I was actually, the example that I gave earlier was somewhat incorrect. A more appropriate or a more kind of concrete example of positive reinforcement might be, a student acting out in class to get the teacher's attention, right? So like the teacher's attention, the teacher's kind of direct focus on the student is increasing the likelihood of that acting out behavior occurring in the future. Ripping up the sheet would be an example of negative reinforcement. So it's a disruptive behavior that leads to the teacher eventually removing the task that I don't want to do. Functional behavior assessments are used to design behavioral intervention plans, and I assume that we're all familiar with BIP. Often there are required IEP components. Well, there are required IEP components for students with all disabilities whose school performance is adversely affected by behavioral issues. Not all students are going to have BIPs, but certainly in those cases that it's behavior that's getting in the way of academic gains, well, behavioral intervention plans are required. There are different ways to go about functional behavioral assessment. Indirect routes, so asking teachers or parents or others who know the child well about the situations in which a problematic behavior usually occurs, or the situations in which it does not occur, and then the reaction that the behavior generally provokes, right? Because it's those reactions that other people's reactions that often unwittingly reinforce a lot of, not a lot of, some of the problem behaviors or antisocial behaviors, especially that we might see students with EBDs manifest in the classroom. From a teacher's perspective, kind of stopping instruction and directing his focus to a student and admonishing that student for disrupting the class, well, from his perspective, that is going to eventually teach that child the lesson that she or he should not be behaving in this way in the classroom. It's actually just that attention that the student is seeking, and so it's it could be a very tricky process, the one involved in knowing how to effectively respond to a student's behavior. There's descriptive functional behavioral assessment. And this requires direct observation, and it's occurring in actually occurring conditions at school in the classroom. And this approach to FBA, a technique called ABC recording, antecedent behavior consequence recording, is used. And so it's a temporal sequence: the antecedent, the behavior, the consequence. So the antecedent, right? These are the conditions or the situations that directly precede the behavior. The behavior is obviously the behavior that the student emits, or the behavior that the student produces in response to the antecedent condition. And the consequence is, well, what happens after the student behaves in that way? So we'll go through a little example here, just so you're all familiar with applying this approach. So we have our student Selena, and when her teachers present her with multiple difficult task demands in her language arts class, she makes negative self-statements about herself, negative statements about herself, excuse me. and instead of actually completing the worksheet, just writes a bunch of swear words all over them. Generally, this results in teachers or teachers' aides sending her to the office with a referral for being disrespectful to the teacher or to the teacher aide. So what would be the end in this situation? We were thinking as functional behavioral assessors.
Being presented with the difficult task.
Right. Having multiple difficult task demands placed upon her. That is the antecedent that is causing Selena's behavior, which is, what is the behavior?
Right.
Condition?
Right in the language and negative self-statements.
Right. And the consequence is that Selena
Goes to the office. Gets a referral.
Right. So that is the consequence. So then what is the function of that behavior? What is the function of this behavior?
She doesn't do the work.
Avoidance. Selena has learned that when she does these things, that she will not have to complete the multiple task demands at that point in time. It's likely that in the future they will be placed on her once again, but at least in that situation, her behavior of making negative self-statements and writing profane language on her worksheets actually reinforced by a typical approach that we use to correct maladaptive behavior in the classroom. What would be if we wanted to really work on this behavior, what would be a more appropriate consequence than sending Selena to the office?
Maybe having her a preferred activity replaced with more language arts work.
Right. So instead of sending her to the office for not, doing her language arts homework, have some kind of, agreement or plan in place that if she does her language arts homework or assignment, well, then she does get to engage in a preferred activity. That's an example of positive behavioral support versus this example, which is a reaction to a negative behavior. And always we want to be leaning toward the development of positive behavioral supports for students with EBDs. And then lastly there, the textbook talks about functional behavior assessment, specifically functional analysis. And this is a situation in which, we might be testing our theory about why a certain behavior is happening. So we might manipulate the antecedent conditions or the consequences surrounding the target behavior just to get a better idea as to whether or not the behavior is happening for the reason that we have hypothesized. So maybe we think that Selena only behaves in this way in language arts class, in her English class, when she is asked to do a bunch of challenging tasks on a worksheet. Well, we could test that hypothesis by placing multiple challenging tasks or demands on her in a science class, in a math class. And maybe she does the same thing in all of these different contexts. So we're forced to kind of retool our hypothesis. It's not just English class, it's actually just the presentation of challenging task demands on Selena that is leading to this behavior. And so basically the same or similar antecedent conditions and consequences that are identified through indirect and descriptive functional behavior assessments are used in this approach called functional analysis. But the variables are manipulated in a controlled setting rather than the natural environment. If we want to, stay true to a pure behavioral way of going about this. So, to make a long story short, behavioral assessment is the most effective way of determining why behavior might be happening and determining ways to go about reducing the likelihood of that behavior occurring in the future. So let's talk about educational approaches for students with EBDs. In terms of curriculum goals, in addition to academics, we should be focusing on personal and social skills. So, specifically those that are going to be necessary for success. Obviously, school, at home, in the community, and in vocational settings. With respect to academic schedules for students with EBDs, nearly all secondary students with this disability have schedules that very closely resemble those of students in just the general education population or students without disabilities. Nearly all of these students are taking English, math, social studies, and science classes. The textbook mentions foreign languages that are often taken at much lower rates than peers without disabilities. Irrespective of what subject we might be instructing a student with an EBD in, instruction that is explicit and systematic is the most effective for helping students make academic progress. Importantly, we must strive to avoid non-compliance or disruptive outbursts by providing students with limited academic instruction. So basically, we don't want to reward antisocial behavior in the classroom by reducing the number of expectations that we place on the child, by reducing the amount of academic focus we put on the child, by making the tasks that we ask of the child easier. So in addition to academics, social skills should also be part of a curriculum for students with EBDs. And the textbook talks about specifically some of the social skills that are important or critical for success in academic settings. These include temper control in conflict situations with peers and adults, following or complying with instruction or teacher directions, attending to teacher instructions, and lastly, transitioning from one classroom activity to another. Of course, these are in addition to some of the other social and interpersonal challenges that we've already considered, specifically those revolving around the development of relationships with peers. There are characteristics of effective social skills and instruction. Here are a few of them. It should include examples or modeling of examples and non-examples of appropriate behavior. So here's an example of what you should do in this situation. Jimmy asks you to, please erase the board for me. Here's an example of what you should not do. Opportunities for role playing. Right, this is giving a student, firsthand experience with, using or functional behavior in a particular social setting. Guided practice with feedback. So not just letting a child fail, but walking the child kind of through the development of the skill and providing feedback along the way, both positive feedback and corrective feedback when what the child is doing is not in line with the target skill that we're trying to teach. And importantly, strategies for promoting generalization to the natural environment. We always want to do, to the greatest extent possible, we want to teach social skills, the context in which we expect students to be applying. So we need to always be thinking about the best way of going about doing that. Regarding research-based teaching practices for students with EBDs, teacher praise. The textbook talks about a number of studies that show positive effects of contingent praise on the behavior of both preschool students and school-age students with and without disabilities. So contingent praise, right? Positive, the teacher praise is occurring contingent on the demonstration of an appropriate behavior in the classroom. Despite documented effectiveness in increasing academic performance, the textbook also discusses the fact that there are many studies that have reported very low rates of teacher praise, which is interesting, but is also understanding. I've definitely been in situations, working with kids with autism, in which, going through a very challenging behavioral tantrum or just kind of engagement with such a child can drain you. And, when the child kind of, is able to conquer himself, you might feel a bit less, a bit less, what's the word I'm looking for? Likely to praise, future instances of positive behavior. But just some tips that are, useful in the classroom. Just be vigilant. Pay attention for behavior that is worthy of praise. Any behavior. Arrange opportunities for students to do things that will gain approval and lead to teacher praise. Jimmy, will you please put this piece of paper in the garbage can? Any very basic task, it's going to be different for one kid versus another, but arranging such opportunities can be very effective. Not worrying about, sounding too contrived when rewarding or when praising at first. Reminding yourself to praise often when the behavior is worthy of praise. Self-monitoring your praising behavior, so ensuring that you are actually praising a student's behavior when that behavior does qualify for it, and not being concerned with overpraising. Consistently praising positive behavior in the classroom is an example of a very kind of explicit, consistently enforced rule. And as we saw, or as we discussed earlier today, often students with EBDs come from households where kind of rules are very inconsistent, in terms of their kind of enforcement between one parent versus another. Active student responding, so activities that require students to actively participate have been shown to produce less misbehavior than do lessons in which students respond occasionally, or lessons in which students are just passively attending. Kind of like the lesson that I'm delivering right now. This probably wouldn't be the best example of a lesson for a student with an EBD. But in the context of group instruction, teachers, we should be aware of 5 tasks if we want to take advantage of or utilize active student responding. So maintaining student attention, giving students sufficient opportunities to respond, providing feedback for students' responses, letting that student, know how he or she did, monitoring a student's learning in the context of the group instruction, and preventing and addressing disruptive behavior. So this requires some proactive strategy, and we'll talk about different ways of going about that in the next couple slides. And the book talks a lot about choral responding, so activities that allow all students to respond simultaneously. And the textbook talks about different kind of ways of going about this, whether it be verbal or use sign cards. A very recent trend and an approach that is, certainly not as easily implementable as some of the other research-based instructional practices that we'll talk about, are school-wide behavioral interventions and supports. So we've talked about this idea that using control misbehavior of specific students can be generally ineffective, both in achieving long-term reductions in that behavior, achieving increases in overall school safety, and more importantly, teaching students desired pro-social behaviors. And so these school-wide plans are intended to achieve student discipline and establish positive school climate procedures simultaneously. And it's essentially just a strategic framework made up of different systems and research-based, scientifically validated interventions for a variety of factors, establishing a positive school culture, teaching and supporting appropriate behaviors that enable the academic and social behavior success of all students. And so this is, I alluded to this idea of more proactive approaches to identifying students who might be experiencing EBDs that are similar to the way the RTI does that for students with specific learning disabilities. And so these school-wide interventions and supports are tiered model that involve a continuum of instructional interventions and behavioral supports that are becoming more targeted and intensive, as indicated by student needs. And so we have a nice little graphic here showing the three different stages, levels of prevention. The primary level of prevention is entailing the stating, definition, explicit teaching of, acknowledgement and reward for behavioral expectations in a classroom, and also the correction of errors, modeling an appropriate behavior for a child who behaved inappropriately in the classroom. And we'll see that, and you can see by that graphic that, primary prevention, kind of universal school-wide classroom and specific setting systems are effective for about 80 to 90% of students. As we move up this pyramid, we're getting into kind of the domain of students who are experiencing more severe behavioral challenges. So at the secondary level, focused behavioral supports are delivered for students who might be considered at risk, small group format. So an example of this is the check-in, check-out approach. The check-in, check-out approach consists of basically a brief meeting at the beginning of the day to set behavioral goals. The point cards the teacher uses to record points based on the student meeting the defined criteria and that give the student feedback at different times during the day. A brief meeting at the end of the day to review how it went. And lastly, rewards, for earning a predetermined number of points. So it's kind of like a token economy approach. And so again, kind of what we're trying to do here is to develop some, help the student herself develop some self-awareness of the behavior and to self-monitor the occurrence of the behavior and to begin to bring that behavior under his own control. At the tertiary level of prevention, we're now getting into the very intensive individualized interventions and ongoing behavioral supports. At this level, we might be conducting functional behavior assessments and developing behavioral intervention plans. We might be considering wraparound services that are occurring outside of the school to address, potential quality of life issues that might be impacting the student's behavior. Self-management, basically making responses to increase or decrease the future frequency of a target behavior that one wishes to change. Self-management is one way to begin to promote generalization and maintenance of gains made from treatment from one setting to another. So it's kind of the end game. But to get to self-management of behavior, of one's behavior, we generally start with self-monitoring. So basically, teach students to observe their own behavior and record the occurrences or the non-occurrences of that target behavior, whatever it might be. And then the second component would be self-evaluation. So teaching a student to compare her or his performance against a predetermined standard or goal. So setting a goal at the beginning of the day, and then asking the student to determine whether or not she met that goal at the end of the day. Proactive, positive classroom management is another research-based intervention that has been shown to decrease antisocial behaviors, increase the frequency of positive teacher-student interactions. And so this approach is involving a proactive strategy or a pre-planned intervention that is going to anticipate behavior problems and stop them before they occur. Can anyone think of ways that we can go about anticipate, or ways that we might stop a behavior before it occurs?
Have a student sit right up at the front, or
right. If a behavior is occurring when a student is sitting in the back of the classroom, move the student to the front of the classroom. Or maybe the student wants to be at the front of the classroom, and when the student can't sit at the front of the classroom, that's when the behavior occurs. So
you could check in with the student when they arrive, like when they get to your class.
Right. So structure.
Give them a schedule. Give them a schedule. Let them know what that schedule is, and timers too work really well.
Right. Those are all good examples. So we might structure the physical environment of the classroom, depending on what the student's needs are. Again, establishing clear, explicit rules and expectations for what appropriate behavior is in the classroom, and then consistently enforcing those rules. Being effective in how we plan transitions, manage transitions and plan lessons with the goal of minimizing downtime that might lead a child or might provide a student the opportunity to engage in disruptive behavior. Provide opportunities to make choices. We have very powerful instructional approach. It gives the child some autonomy. Creative ways to present instruction to students that might increase that student's probability of compliance. So if we, know of specific ways that a student, learns best or, prefers to learn, well, we want to try to, utilize those to the greatest extent possible in our lesson planning. Keeping students active during instruction. And lastly, praising and positively reinforcing desired behaviors. All with the end goal of anticipating and addressing problem behaviors before they occur. To be effective, there is some knowledge of a variety of behavioral principles required in this approach. These include shaping behavior. Does anyone know what shaping, what behavior shape means? How would we shape a problematic behavior?
Shaping behavior means at close counts.
Close counts. Is that what you said, Bob?
Yeah.
Can you be more explicit?
You're looking for approximations. If you want a child to give you prolonged eye contact, if his eyes just slide across your face, reinforce that.
Right. If a student doesn't want to sit in his desk, well, first let's just reinforce the student walking up to the door of the classroom. And then let's reinforce the student opening the door. Then let's reinforce the student just crossing the threshold into the classroom. So basically, using kind of a task analysis approach and breaking down the behavior and reinforcing kind of, closer and closer approximations to it. Contingency contracting. Again, this is just referring to behavioral contracts, rewards that are contingent upon the demonstration of appropriate classroom behavior. Extinction. What does extinction refer to?
Isn't it just like eliminating undesirable behaviors?
Just eliminating the undesirable behavior, exactly. We might do this through ignoring it. We might do this through differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors. So as Nate gave the example earlier, instead of, sending Selena to the office for writing a bunch of swear words on her homework assignment, we set up a contingency contract in which we reward her behavior of actually sitting down and completing the assessment or the activity appropriately. Response costs approaches, basically setting up, basic response costs is referring to, well, what's going to happen if you engage in this behavior in the classroom during instruction. Timeouts, overcorrection. What does overcorrection refer to?
Well, if you have a spitter, for example, having your spitter fill a cup.
Right. So if a student spits a lot, give that student a cup and say, the demand is that it's to fill the entire cup up, which is another very common example is, if a student, rips up his worksheet and throws it all over the ground, make that student, pick up all those pieces of paper and walk them over to the garbage can over and over and over and over again. So we just kind of make the student engage in the corrective procedure over and over again. Token economy. This is just referring to approaches that are reinforcing instances of positive behavior and then allowing a student to earn some kind of reward as a result of engaging in the positive or pro-social behavior. And so, maybe a student gets a token, at the end of each day for meeting their behavioral goals. And, after that student earns 10 tokens, she or he gets to, I don't know, do some preferred activity, go watch a movie with a friend or something along those lines. Peer mediation and support. So getting peers involved is effective. So using peer mentors, teaching a student's peers to observe and record a peer's behavior and provide that with feedback. Positive peer reporting, so teaching and encouraging and reinforcing students for reporting each other's positive behaviors. Not just, telling on a student when she or he does something inappropriate, but teaching students to focus on the positive. So again, emphasis on the positive reinforcement here. Peer tutoring, allowing and teaching peers to serve as tutors for one another. This is also a good opportunity to provide students who have EBDs with opportunities to practice social skills. Peer support and confirmation. So training peers to acknowledge one another's positive behaviors, and when inappropriate behaviors occur or are about to occur, explaining to peers why they're problematic and suggesting or modeling appropriate alternative responses. So this is a much more kind of involved approach to managing problematic behaviors, but certainly one that can be effective. And more importantly, it's involving the entire classroom. It's not just targeting a student who might have an EBD. It is taking advantage of the entire group. Okay, so I'm actually going to stop here. There are just a few more slides that you can go over, 5 more to be exact, but we've unfortunately reached our deadline. Again, if you have any questions, need any clarification, feel free to reach out to me. As you begin working on your papers, if questions come up, if you're having trouble locating resources, do let me know. So thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.